I had been out of work for exactly 8 months and 9 days when the message appeared in my inbox. My name is Marcus Webb. My bank account was in the negative. A stack of overdue rent notices sat on my kitchen table. I'd been eating plain rice and canned beans for 2 weeks straight, stretching every last dollar as far as it could go. When you have nothing left, when you are genuinely scraping the bottom of everything, your brain stops seeing warning signs. Danger stops looking dangerous. Strange starts looking normal. Desperate people do not ask questions. They just say yes. The job offer came from a company called Vault 7 Holdings. According to their website, they were a private records management firm located in a tall, dark office building in the middle of the city. I had applied for a simple data processing role through a general job listing website several weeks earlier and had completely forgotten about it. Then, without warning, they sent me a short email asking me to come in for an interview at midnight. I did not think too hard about the hour. I put on my cleanest shirt, my one pair of dress trousers, and took the last bus into the city centre. The building was completely empty when I arrived. The lobby lights were dimmed to almost nothing. A security guard sitting behind the front desk barely looked up when I walked in. He checked my name against a printed list, handed my identification back without a word, and pointed me toward a service elevator near the back of the lobby. The elevator panel had only 2 buttons. One was labeled with a capital B, the other had no label at all. The guard pressed the unlabeled button for me and stepped back. The elevator descended for a long time, longer than made any physical sense for a building of that height. The interview did not take place in a modern office with glass walls and ergonomic chairs. It took place in a low, wide basement room with bare concrete walls, a grey cement floor, and a single row of buzzing fluorescent lights running along the ceiling. The room smelled like dust and old paper and the faint chemical sharpness of machine oil. The man who interviewed me was named Mr. Calloway. He was somewhere in his late 50s, with grey hair neatly combed back and a dark suit that looked expensive and completely out of place in the underground room. He shook my hand firmly, gestured to a metal folding chair, and sat down across from me on another folding chair. There was no desk between us. He asked me almost nothing about my work history. He did not ask about my skills, my qualifications, or my previous employers. Instead, he asked about my personal life. He asked whether I lived alone. He asked whether I had family in the city. He asked how I handled long stretches of silence and whether I was comfortable working without supervision through the night. I answered every question honestly. I lived alone in a small apartment across town. My closest relatives were 3 states away. Silence did not bother me. I was used to being by myself. He nodded slowly after each answer, as if confirming something he already suspected. Then he offered me the job. The salary he named made my breath stop for a moment. It was more money than I had earned in the previous 3 years put together. My title would be Records Disposal Operative. My shift would run from midnight to 8 in the morning, 5 nights per week. My only duty was to operate an industrial document shredding machine located in the basement and destroy a large backlog of archived files. I accepted immediately. I did not hesitate for even a second. Mr. Calloway nodded, reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket, and handed me a heavy brass key card. Then he stood and walked me to the far side of the basement room, where the largest machine I had ever seen in my life was sitting against the wall. The shredder was enormous. It occupied the center of the room like a small building of its own. A wide rubber conveyor belt sloped upward at a gentle angle, feeding into a large steel hopper at the top. Inside the hopper, I could see rows of thick, interlocking metal drums studded with sharp cutting blades. A clear plastic collection bag the size of a small car was attached to the exhaust vent at the side, waiting to collect the shredded output. Beside the machine, stacked in tall, uneven columns that nearly reached the ceiling, were dozens of heavy cardboard boxes. Each one was packed full of paper files, folders, and documents. On the concrete wall next to the machine, someone had mounted a plain wooden bulletin board. A single sheet of paper, sealed in a clear laminate sleeve, was pinned to the board. Mr. Calloway gestured toward it. "Those are your operational guidelines," he said, his voice even and calm. "Read them. Follow them exactly. I will be back at 8 in the morning." He walked back to the service elevator without another word. The metal doors slid shut. The mechanical hum of the elevator climbing back up to the surface faded into silence. I was completely alone. I walked to the bulletin board and read the laminated sheet. I had expected standard workplace safety instructions. Keep hands clear of the blades. Wear eye protection. Do not reach into the machine while it is running. Instead, the page contained 4 short rules typed in plain black text. Rule 1. Do not read the contents of the orange folders. Rule 2. If the shredder stops and begins to leak a dark red liquid, unplug it immediately and stand facing the wall until all sound stops. Rule 3. If you find a photograph of yourself among the documents, feed it into the shredder immediately without looking away from it. Rule 4. If someone knocks on the steel elevator doors at any point between 2 and 4 in the morning, do not open them, do not respond, do not make a sound. I stood there reading the 4 rules twice, then a third time. They made no sense. I decided they were an internal joke. Some kind of informal hazing tradition left over from a previous employee who had a dark sense of humor. Large organizations with strange night shift environments sometimes develop these kinds of unofficial rituals to mess with new hires. I figured the real test was whether I would follow bizarre instructions without asking for an explanation, which is exactly the kind of obedient, low-maintenance employee a company processing confidential documents would want. I decided to ignore the strangeness of the rules and do the job I was being paid to do. I walked to the control panel, found the green power button, and pressed it. The machine woke up with a sound like a small earthquake. A deep, grinding roar filled the concrete room and vibrated up through the soles of my shoes. The conveyor belt began to move, rolling steadily upward toward the hungry steel blades. I grabbed the nearest cardboard box, hauled it over to the belt, and started feeding. The work was simple. Grab a handful of folders, place them on the moving belt, step back, watch them disappear into the hopper with a tearing, crunching sound, reach for another handful, repeat. The hours passed slowly. The noise of the machine was constant and all-consuming. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me. The air grew thick with paper dust that settled on my forearms and stuck to the back of my throat. I fell into a rhythm without thinking, my hands moving automatically while my mind drifted to other things. I was working through the 14th box of the night when I saw the folder. It was sitting in the middle of a stack of standard beige folders, impossible to miss. It was bright orange, solid orange cardstock with no label, no writing, no identifying markings of any kind on the outside. I remembered Rule 1. My plan was simple. Grab the orange folder, toss it directly onto the moving belt, do not open it, and move on. I reached for it, gripped it firmly, and swung my arm toward the conveyor belt. The folder slipped. My hands were coated in a fine layer of paper dust. The cardstock was smooth. The folder twisted out of my fingers, clipped the edge of the steel hopper, and fell backward, landing flat on the concrete floor near my feet. The impact popped the folder open. A thick stack of loose pages slid out across the dusty ground, fanning open in a rough semicircle around my boots. I crouched down to gather the pages, intending to stuff them back into the folder without reading a single word. The text on the top page was printed in a large, clear font. My eyes caught it before I could stop them. The document read like a clinical case file. The language was cold and precise, the kind of formal, stripped-down writing used in medical reports or legal evidence summaries. It described an investigation into a series of disappearances in a residential neighborhood. The victims had been found with their physical bodies entirely intact from the outside, but completely hollowed internally. All soft tissue, organs, and biological material had been removed and replaced with tightly compacted fine grey ash. Below the written summary was a detailed illustration drawn in precise black ink. The drawing showed a shape that had no clean name in any normal vocabulary. It was built from dense, overlapping lines, suggesting a mass that was simultaneously solid and fluid. It had no fixed form. The overall impression was of something reaching in many directions at once, as if it existed in more dimensions than the flat page could contain. A typed caption beneath the illustration described the entity as a 2-dimensional predator. It did not exist in 3-dimensional space in the way that physical objects do. Instead, it lived inside flat surfaces. It lived inside shadows. More specifically, it lived inside the shadows cast by human beings. The caption described the mechanism of attack in plain, clinical language. The entity would attach itself to a person's shadow and travel with them, unseen, sometimes for years. It fed slowly. It hollowed its host from the inside out, consuming biological material and replacing it with ash, over a period of months or years. The single method of containment listed in the document was direct, sustained eye contact. If a person observed the entity inside the shadow and maintained unbroken visual contact with it, The entity was trapped in the flat surface and could not detach. If the observer looked away, even briefly, the entity would detach from the surface and immediately consume the observer's physical body. I gathered the pages quickly, shoved them back into the orange folder, and stood up. My rational mind immediately manufactured an explanation. Records management companies stored files for all kinds of clients. Vault 7 likely handled archives for entertainment studios, game developers, or publishers involved in legal disputes. These were creative development documents for a horror project, concept notes, world-building material for a novel or a film. Someone had paid good money to have this fictional material securely destroyed, and I had just accidentally read part of a creative brief. I pushed the orange folder onto the conveyor belt without another thought. The belt carried it upward. The folder dropped into the hopper. The machine produced a sound I had not heard before, not the normal tearing crunch of shredded paper. This was a violent metallic screech, like two heavy gears trying to occupy the same space at the same time. The grinding drums locked up. The conveyor belt shuddered and stopped. The deafening roar of the motor cut down to a strained, struggling hum as the engine fought against something it could not process. I stepped back and looked at the hopper. A dark red liquid was rising slowly between the stationary blades. It was thick, it moved heavily, pooling over the jammed gears with a sluggish consistency that had nothing in common with hydraulic fluid or machine oil. It was dark and warm-colored, and it smelled like copper and raw electricity. Rule 2 came into my mind with a sudden cold clarity. If the shredder stops and begins to leak a dark red liquid, unplug it immediately and stand facing the wall until all sound stops. I looked at the heavy power cable running from the base of the machine to the industrial wall socket. I looked at the bare concrete wall behind me. I looked back at the machine. I thought about Mr. Calloway arriving at 8 in the morning to find a $200,000 piece of equipment destroyed on my first night. I thought about my overdue rent. I thought about the bus ride home to an empty apartment with no food in the cupboard. I decided I could not follow Rule 2. I needed to fix the jam myself, restart the machine, and clean up the liquid before the morning shift. I was going to clear the blockage. I stepped up to the edge of the hopper and looked down into the locked blades. The orange folder had been reduced to shredded strips of cardstock, but beneath the torn material I could see the actual cause of the jam. A thick bundle of glossy, heavy stock photographs had been wedged tightly between the two main cutting drums, preventing them from rotating. I reached my right hand carefully into the hopper, feeling my way around the stationary blades, using my fingertips to find the edge of the photograph bundle. I gripped it, I pulled. It came free with a slow, reluctant resistance, like pulling something out of wet sand. I lifted the stack of photographs out of the machine and held them under the fluorescent light. I wiped a smear of dark red liquid off the top image with the ball of my thumb. I looked at the photograph. Every muscle in my body went rigid. The image showed a young boy in a small bedroom. He was holding a plastic model of a space shuttle and grinning at the camera with a gap-toothed smile. I recognized the bedroom immediately. The faded blue curtains, the specific crack in the corner of the ceiling, the shelf of model kits above the bed, the exact pattern of the old carpet. It was my bedroom, the house I grew up in. I had not seen that room in over 15 years. The boy in the photograph was me, at roughly 8 years old. I had never seen this photograph before in my life. My eyes moved from my younger face to the background of the image. The bedroom wall behind young Marcus was lit up by camera flash, throwing a hard shadow against the painted surface. The shadow did not belong to a small boy. The shadow stretching across the wall behind my childhood self was enormous. It had long, multi-jointed arms that bent at wrong angles. Its head opened at the top like a split seam, widening into a dark, jagged gap. The proportions were impossible. The overall shape was identical to the entity drawn in precise black ink on the documents I had just read. The shadow creature had been with me since childhood. My hands were shaking. I flipped to the next photograph in the stack. It showed me at my secondary school graduation. I was standing on a playing field in a dark cap and gown, surrounded by other students. The entity's shadow stretched out behind me across the grass, its long, dark fingers curling around the ankles of the people standing on either side of me. I turned to the next photograph. It was recent, very recent. It showed me sitting at my own kitchen table at some point in the last few months, looking exhausted and hollow. The shadow was no longer just on the wall. It was expanding across the entire photograph, consuming the edges of the image, creeping toward my physical body from multiple directions at once. I understood. The shadow had been attached to me for most of my life, and the document said it would eventually hollow me out completely, replace everything inside me with ash. And now I was holding the photographs and I had to follow Rule 3. If you find a photograph of yourself among the documents, feed it into the shredder immediately without looking away from it. I had to feed these photographs into the machine right now. I could not look away from them. I had to keep my eyes locked on the entity and the images, while simultaneously getting the photographs into the shredder. But the shredder was jammed. And to fix the jam, Rule 2 said I had to unplug the machine and stand facing the wall until the sound stopped. If I turned my back to follow Rule 2, I would be looking away from the photographs, which would violate Rule 3. I could not obey both rules at the same time. I stood in the cold basement and stared at the top photograph and tried to think clearly. As I watched the glossy surface of the image, something began to move. The shadow in the photograph was moving. Not the boy in the image, not any element of the background, just the shadow. The dark mass behind my younger self began to shift slowly. The way oil moves on the surface of water, the jagged split at the top of the entity's head rotated, tilted, it angled upward, toward the surface of the photograph, toward me. The entity was looking up out of the image at me. At the same time, the struggling hum of the jammed motor began to change. It deepened, it developed a rhythm, a heavy, slow pulse that I felt through the floor before I heard it through the air. It sounded like a heartbeat, a very large, very slow heartbeat coming from somewhere inside the steel casing of the machine. The dark red liquid in the hopper began to bubble. It spilled over the edge and hit the concrete floor, spreading outward in thin, dark streams. But instead of spreading randomly the way spilled liquid should, the streams moved with direction. They curved, they reached, they crawled across the floor toward my boots like the fingers of a slow hand. The fluorescent light directly above me started to flicker. In the rapid alternation between light and dark, I saw my shadow change. With every flash of darkness, my shadow on the wall grew. The arms extended, the proportions shifted. The outline of my head began to pull apart at the top, widening into a jagged split that I recognized immediately. My own shadow was becoming the shape of the entity. It was detaching. It was preparing to move. The containment rule from the orange folder documents was the same as Rule 3 from the laminated sheet on the bulletin board. I had to maintain eye contact with the entity. If I looked away, it would complete the detachment and consume me. I had to get those photographs into the shredder, but I could not look away from them to unplug the machine and clear the jam. I had to find a third way. I thought about it for a few seconds that felt much longer. The machine was jammed because the photographs had been blocking the drums. I had already removed the photographs from the drums, which meant the only remaining obstruction was whatever had been underneath the photographs. I had felt something hard and smooth when my hand was inside the hopper before I pulled the photographs free. Something calcified and dense, wedged deeper between the main grinding cylinders. If I could remove that secondary obstruction while keeping my eyes on the photographs, the machine might restart on its own once power was restored. That meant I had to do three things simultaneously: hold the photographs up and keep my eyes locked on the shifting entity inside them, reach my free hand back down into the hopper and find and remove the secondary blockage by touch alone. Do not break eye contact for a single moment. I lifted the stack of photographs to eye level. I stared into the face of the entity looking up at me from inside the image. My right hand went into the hopper. The dark red liquid scalded my skin immediately. The heat was sharp and immediate, and it felt wrong in a way that went beyond temperature. The liquid felt like it had weight, like it had pressure, like it was pressing back against my hand with deliberate force. My knuckles burned and my fingers went partly numb from the combination of pain and shock. I pushed my hand deeper. My fingertips found the steel drums. I felt along the grooves of the cutting blades carefully, aware that if my hand slipped even slightly, the edges would cut through to the bone. There was something wedged between the primary and secondary cutting cylinders. My fingers traced its outline. It was smooth, hard, dense, curved in a way that felt biological rather than mechanical. It felt like a section of calcified bone. I did not think about what that meant. I closed my hand around it as firmly as I could. Above me, the fluorescent light continued to strobe. My shadow on the wall was barely human-shaped anymore. The ceiling above it seemed to darken, as if the shadow was pulling darkness down from the room's upper space, building itself a body out of accumulated dark. The heartbeat pulse from the motor was faster now, louder. The streams of red liquid on the floor had wrapped around my boots and were pulling upward, a slow, steady pressure against my ankles, like hands gripping from below. I pulled the obstruction upward. It moved, scraped against the steel walls of the hopper with a grinding bone-on-metal sound. Then it came free all at once, and I yanked my hand out of the machine and threw the dense, hard object over my shoulder without looking at it. I heard it hit the concrete floor behind me with a heavy, hollow crack. The shredder roared. The motor snapped from a strained hum to a full, deafening scream in under a second. The cutting drums spun. The conveyor belt began to move again. Red liquid sprayed outward in a fine mist from the churning blades. The sudden explosive sound broke my concentration for a fraction of a second. My eyes pulled away from the photographs. The fluorescent light above me exploded. Not flickered out. Exploded. The glass tube shattered inward, raining splinters and white powder down onto my shoulders and into my hair. The room went dark, except for the faint red glow of the control panel and the dull emergency strip lighting mounted near the floor along the far wall. I snapped my eyes back down to the photographs in my hand. The ceiling above me was no longer empty. The detached shadow had built itself into something with volume and presence. It filled the upper half of the room, pressing downward. The temperature dropped sharply, the kind of cold that goes deeper than skin. The air in my chest felt thin and difficult to move. Breathing required deliberate effort. The enormous split-headed shape was descending toward me. I looked at the photographs. I locked my vision onto the shifting entity inside the glossy surface of the top image. And I thrust the entire stack of photographs directly into the spinning blades of the shredder. The steel teeth caught the glossy paper instantly. The machine pulled the stack in with violent mechanical greed, tearing the images apart in a fraction of a second. The moment the blades touched the first photograph, a wave of nausea hit me hard enough to stagger. A sharp, drilling pain erupted at the base of my skull and spread forward through my head, as if something was being forcibly extracted from the inside of my brain. I dropped to one knee on the concrete floor, clutching the side of the hopper with my burned right hand, gasping. With every photograph that passed through the blades, the pain in my head surged and then faded back by a half step, like a tide going out one wave at a time. A sound came from the shadow filling the ceiling above me. It was not a mechanical sound, and it was not a human sound. It was something that passed through the bones of my skull and vibrated my back teeth. A long tearing noise, like something being peeled away from the surface of reality. A shriek of something that had existed in my life undetected since I was 8 years old and was only now being forced to give up its hold. The shredder swallowed the last photograph. The sound stopped. The pain dropped away completely, leaving only a dull, warm ache that faded over the next few minutes. I opened my eyes. The ceiling was empty. The room was just a room again, grey and cold and quiet except for the steady roar of the machine. I looked at my shadow on the floor in the red glow of the control panel. It was mine again, just mine. A plain, human-shaped shadow, exactly the right size, exactly the right proportions, cast by a 31-year-old man kneeling on a dusty concrete floor. I looked at the red streams that had been crawling toward me across the ground. They had dried. They had turned into a fine, harmless grey powder that scattered when I shifted my foot. I looked at my right hand. The burning was gone. The skin was coated in what looked like dark red ink, and when I rubbed it between my fingers, it crumbled like dried pigment, harmless, residual. The heartbeat rhythm inside the motor smoothed out and disappeared, leaving only the clean, mechanical sound of a functioning industrial engine. I sat down on the concrete floor. I sat there and I did not touch another box. I did not stand up. I did not move. I sat with my back against the cold steel casing of the shredder, and I stared at the far wall and waited for the clock to finish its work. I sat there for nearly 4 hours. At some point around 3 in the morning, there was a knock on the steel elevator doors. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, a pause, 3 more. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I stared at the far wall and listened to the machine and waited. The knocking came again at 3:15, then at 3:40, then it stopped completely and did not return. I sat on the floor until morning. At exactly 8 o'clock, the elevator hummed. The doors slid open. Mr. Calloway walked into the basement carrying a ceramic travel mug, his dark suit pressed and neat, his grey hair combed back perfectly. He stopped a few feet into the room and looked at the floor. He looked at the grey powder scattered around my boots. He looked at the shattered remains of the fluorescent tube. He looked at the dark red ink drying on my right hand. He looked at the hard, calcified object I had thrown over my shoulder in the dark, which had come to rest against the base wall on the far side of the room. He looked at it for a moment longer than he looked at anything else. Then he looked at me. A slow, genuine smile came to his face. "Well," he said. He took a sip from his travel mug. "You are the first one to make it through the first shift in over 14 months, he said. "The last 3 didn't last until 2 in the morning." I pushed myself up off the floor. My legs were stiff and my back ached from sitting on concrete for 4 hours. I looked at him. "What is this place?" I said. My voice was rough, low. I did not have much volume left. "I told you," he said. "Records management." "That is not what this is." He nodded slowly, conceding the point. He walked over to the control panel and pressed the red shutdown button. The machine wound down over about 30 seconds, the grinding roar fading to a mechanical whisper and then to silence. The sudden quiet was enormous and strange. "Think of it this way," he said, setting his travel mug on the edge of the control panel and folding his arms. "Reality is not as solid as it appears. The world you can see and touch exists alongside other things, older things, things that do not have physical bodies in the way that you do. They exist in gaps, in margins, in the flat spaces between surfaces and light." He looked at the machine with what appeared to be genuine respect. When those things cross over and make contact with people, evidence accumulates. Files, photographs, written records, memory traces encoded in physical objects, and those records are dangerous, not because the information in them is classified in any official sense, but because human belief has weight. If people carry the knowledge of these entities, the entities can use that belief as an anchor. They can use it to make themselves more real, more permanent. He patted the steel casing of the shredder. "This machine does not simply cut paper," he said. "It processes conceptual material. When a file about one of these entities is fed through the blades, the knowledge encoded in the document is not just destroyed. It is digested. The reality anchor is dissolved. The events described in the file become progressively more difficult for the human brain to hold on to. Witnesses forget. Investigators lose the thread. Coroners file amended reports with more comfortable conclusions. The event is still real. It happened, but the evidence of it dissolves back into the background, and the entities cannot use it to pull themselves further forward." He looked at me. "The machine itself is not entirely mechanical," he added. "I imagine you already worked that out." I thought about the heartbeat pulse, the scalding liquid that felt like living tissue, the bone-hard obstruction in the cutting drums that I did not look at after I threw it across the room. The people who built it engineered it from something that already understood how to process these materials, he said simply, in a tone that suggested this explanation was sufficient and that I should not ask him to expand on it. I did not ask him to expand on it. "The technician before you," I said, "the last one." He opened the elevator doors at 3 in the morning. "Mr. Calloway said, we found the key card on the floor. We never found anything else." He picked up his travel mug. "You did well tonight," he said. "Better than well. In fact, the jam situation was a real problem. The previous 3 technicians all failed at an earlier stage, before the complication even had a chance to develop. You improvised correctly. You found a way to satisfy both requirements simultaneously, even when they appeared to be in conflict. That is exactly the kind of clear thinking this role requires." He looked at me steadily. "We have a significant backlog," he said. "Several large clients have submitted archives. The volume of incoming material is going to increase substantially over the next few months. I need someone reliable on the midnight shift 5 nights a week." He set a plain white envelope on the edge of the control panel beside his travel mug. "Your first week's payment," he said, "in advance." I walked over to the small table in the corner where I had left my jacket. I put it on. I looked at the envelope on the control panel. I thought about my bank account, the rent notices on the kitchen table, the empty cupboards. I thought about the 4 hours I had just spent sitting on a cold concrete floor, holding photographs of my own childhood, while something ancient and hollow and many-armed tried to peel my shadow off my body and swallow me from the outside in. I thought about Rule 4 and the 3 slow knocks on the elevator door at 3 in the morning, and whatever had been standing on the other side of it in the dark. I picked up the envelope. I walked to the elevator and pressed the call button. The doors slid open. The elevator was empty. I stepped in. As the doors closed, I looked back at the basement room. The stacked boxes, the industrial machine sitting silent and waiting in the center of the floor, the laminated rules pinned to the wooden board on the concrete wall, the grey powder drying on the ground where the crawling streams had been. The doors closed. The elevator began to rise. I tucked the envelope into my jacket pocket. I would be back at midnight. I did not pretend otherwise, not even to myself. The money was real, the rent was real, the cold and the hunger and the 8 months and 9 days of nothing were real. Whatever was down there in that basement was also real, and I had survived one night of it, and that was more than most people managed. I told myself I would buy a proper meal before the next shift. I would sleep for a full 8 hours. I would read the laminated rules one more time, carefully, and commit every word to memory. And I would not open the elevator doors, no matter how long the knocking lasted. Looking back over the past year, it feels genuinely strange to remember what my life used to be. Simple, unremarkable, mine. That version of me is gone now. I am not sure I could get him back even if I tried. Here is the one thing that defines my life today. I have to eat dinner every night at exactly 7 p.m., not around 7. Not between 6:30 and 7:30, exactly 7 o'clock. If I miss the window, there are consequences. And I do not mean consequences like feeling hungry or falling off a routine. I mean real, external consequences that have nothing to do with my own choices. Someone else decides them. I know how that sounds, but stay with me. My name is Daniel Marsh. I work as an audio engineer, mostly doing post-production sound design for small film studios and independent podcast producers. It is a good job. Quiet, methodical, mostly solitary. I have always preferred it that way. About a year ago, my sister Priya was visiting from out of town. She had driven 4 hours to celebrate with me after I finally finished my certification in acoustic engineering, something I had been working toward for nearly 2 years while keeping up my regular workload. It was a big deal to me, even if the outside world had no idea it existed. Priya knew what it meant. She booked us a table at a high-end restaurant called Osteria Vela, a place known for its rotating seasonal menus and its exceptionally difficult reservation system. She had booked it 6 weeks in advance. Her boyfriend James came along with 2 of my oldest friends, Nina and Cole. We arrived around 6:30 on a Saturday evening. Osteria Vela was located in a converted warehouse space in the Arts District. Exposed brick, low pendant lighting, a long open kitchen behind glass where you could watch the cooks work. The kind of place where the menu changes every 3 months and the sommelier remembers every table he has ever served. We were seated in a curved booth near the window. The table had fresh eucalyptus running down the center. I'm going to be completely honest, I am not a fine dining person. I grew up eating supermarket pasta and whatever could be thrown together quickly after a long shift at whatever part-time job I was holding down. My default dinner is toast with peanut butter or a bowl of instant soup eaten while listening back to audio tracks on my headphones. Being in a restaurant like Osteria Vela made me feel like I was wearing borrowed clothes. I appreciated that Priya had gone to the effort, but I spent most of the first half hour just trying to look comfortable. We had drinks, we laughed. Nina and Cole got into a long debate about whether a certain film score was deliberately referencing another composer. Priya held my hand across the table and told me she was proud of me. James was quiet in that easygoing way he has, just happy to be there. As the clock moved towards 7, I noticed someone approaching our table who was not a regular server. He was tall and lean, with short dark hair, maybe 50 years old, in a spotless white chef's coat. He was carrying a single small plate himself, which is how I knew he was not a runner. He set it down in front of me personally. The plate held a small portion of wood-roasted duck breast over a thin smear of parsnip puree, finished with a micro-herb garnish, and 3 drops of something dark and glossy that I later learned was a reduced blackberry and tamarind sauce. "Compliments of the kitchen," he said, "for the table's guest of honor." I started to say it was not my birthday, but Priya spoke before I could. She explained what we were celebrating. The chef nodded, smiled, and said something I have thought about many times since. "Then you are someone who listens very carefully. I can always tell." He introduced himself only as Chef Reyes. I had seen his face before on a cooking program I half-watched one evening. He shook my hand and left. A clock somewhere in the restaurant chimed. 7 o'clock exactly. I picked up my fork and took a bite. The duck was extraordinary, rich and slightly smoky, with a tenderness that made no sense given how small the portion was. The parsnip was smooth and slightly sweet. The blackberry reduction cut through both with a sourness that was perfectly placed. It was 3 or 4 bites and it was over, but I thought about it for the rest of the evening. We finished dinner and caught a cab home. A good night, a good memory. Then, around midnight, I got an alert on my banking app. Someone had deposited $60 into my account with no description, no sender name, nothing. I assumed it was Priya. She sometimes does things like that without telling me, quietly dropping money into my account with a note that says nothing at all, thinking I will figure it out. I texted her. She said it was not her. I texted Nina and Cole, neither of them. I sent James a message asking if maybe he had used the wrong account number for something. He had no idea what I was talking about. The money sat in my account, $60, no explanation. 2 days later, I was home in the evening, eating leftover rice and black beans I had made in bulk on the weekend. A habit. Cheap, filling, easy. I ate at my desk while reviewing a rough audio mix, not thinking about the time at all. When I finally checked the clock, it was 7:15. I had started eating around 7:10. Nothing happened that night, no deposit. The following evening I made the same rice and beans again. This time I happened to glance at the clock right as I sat down. 7:02, close enough. My phone buzzed about 40 minutes later. $55. I started paying attention. Over the next 2 weeks I kept track of everything in a notes file on my laptop. Date, time I sat down to eat, what I ate, whether I received a deposit, and how much. The pattern was clear and it was unmistakable. On nights when I ate dinner before or after 7, nothing. On nights when I sat down within a few minutes of 7, money. The amount varied. Some nights $30, some nights $90. 2 things bothered me immediately. First, the varying amounts implied some kind of evaluation, not just that I was eating, but how I was eating, or what. Some meals scored higher than others. That meant something or someone was making a judgment call each time. Second, and far more unsettling, whoever was doing this could tell. They knew when I was eating. They could distinguish a qualifying dinner from a non-qualifying one. They could tell the difference between a proper meal and a snack. That level of awareness required observation. Someone, somehow, was watching me eat. I went through the obvious explanations first. I checked my phone for spyware. I hired a friend who does IT security work to look at my laptop and router. I checked every smoke alarm and power outlet cover in my apartment for hidden cameras. I found nothing. I borrowed a signal detector from the same IT friend and swept the apartment. Nothing. I was not being watched by any conventional means that I could identify. That left unconventional means. I ran tests. I ate in closets. I ate under a blanket on the floor of my bedroom with the lights off. I ate in the back seat of my car with the windows fogged. Every time I ate a real, proper dinner at 7 o'clock, the deposit arrived. The darkness did not matter. The location did not matter. The physical impossibility of being observed did not matter at all. I decided that if whatever was watching me could hear me, maybe I could communicate with it. One evening I sat down with a simple bowl of pasta, and before I took a single bite, I spoke to the empty room. If you can hear this, add exactly 45 cents to tonight's deposit. I had never received fractional cents before. Every previous deposit had been a clean round number. I sat through my meal with a kind of tight, electric feeling in my chest, not quite fear. Something closer to the feeling you get when you are waiting for an experiment result you cannot yet predict. The deposit came through around 8 o'clock. $71.45. It heard me. I spent the next several weeks building out a communication system. I used yes and no questions exclusively at first. 50 cents for yes, 25 cents for no. The answers were always reliable. I would ask something before dinner, and the corresponding fraction would appear in the deposit without fail. Can you see me right now? Yes. Do you mean to harm me? No. Do you know who I am? Yes. Have you been watching me for a long time? Yes. Then I built a letter-to-number mapping. I assigned each letter of the alphabet a cent value from 1 to 26 and asked the entity to spell out answers over multiple nights. It took patience. Some nights I would get only 2 letters, but I was consistent, and after a while patterns began to form. I learned the following things over the course of approximately 6 weeks. The entity watching me was not a living person in any traditional sense. It could not physically move through space the way I could. It could not touch anything. It had no conventional location, and yet it existed somewhere that it described, over several fragmented nights, as east of the Missouri River in a region of flat land and thin light. When I pressed further, it lost clarity. as though it was uncertain of its own position. It had been a person once. It was not a ghost. It was emphatic about the distinction, responding to ghost with a quick, firm 25-cent rejection. Whatever it was now, it occupied a state somewhere between memory and presence that did not map to any category I already had a word for. It experienced the world through borrowed perception. Specifically, it could experience sight and taste through the senses of a person it had formed some kind of connection with. That connection, I was beginning to understand, had been initiated at 7 o'clock on the night I ate the duck at Osteria Vela. The entity had been attached to Chef Reyes first. Reyes had, apparently without fully understanding why, spent years perfecting certain dishes that the entity found particularly vivid through a host's perception. Reyes had been the primary connection for years, until me. I asked why I had replaced Reyes. The answer, spelled out over 4 nights, was this: best taste, clearest. Whatever the duck dish had done, it had established something in the entity's experience that it had not found before. Some quality of how I perceived the meal, some sharpness or clarity in my sensory response, had made me the most vivid host the entity had encountered. I asked whether Reyes knew. Yes. Chef Reyes arrived at my apartment on a Thursday evening, 9 weeks after the celebration dinner at Osteria Vela. I had suspected he might reach out. The entity had begun sending me unprompted messages, fragments of letters in the cent amounts that were not answers to any question I asked. One of them, assembled over 3 nights, read simply, Reyes knows. Still, opening the door to find him standing there in a plain grey jacket, looking significantly less imposing than he had in his kitchen whites, was jarring. He introduced himself properly. We sat down at my kitchen table. He accepted coffee and looked around the apartment with an expression I could not quite read. You are getting deposits, he said, not a question. Yes, I said. More than you were before? I think so. I have nothing to compare to. He nodded slowly. He explained that he had been receiving deposits for over 7 years. It had begun the same way mine had, with an inexplicable transfer after a meal, followed by the gradual understanding that something was evaluating his cooking. He had built a career, in part, on refining his ability to produce meals that the entity found compelling. The deposits had funded his restaurant. They had funded his staff, his equipment, his international training trips. Then, about 2 months before my sister booked her table, the deposits had slowed. Over the following weeks, they dropped further. The night he served me the duck, they stopped entirely. I think it follows quality, he said. Intensity of experience. Whatever it tastes through you, it found something that it had not found through me. And so you came here, I said. I came here, he agreed, to propose an arrangement. The arrangement was simple on paper. Reyes would come to my apartment 2 nights per week and prepare dinner. He would get his deposits back through whatever arrangement he had with the entity, triggered by cooking for me specifically. I would receive my own deposits as normal. We would both benefit. I asked him whether this bothered him, the idea of an unseen entity experiencing the world through our senses. He was quiet for a moment. Less than it should, he said. I stopped asking those questions years ago. The money is real. The food is real. I focus on those. I agreed to the arrangement, partly because the money was genuinely useful, and partly because I was deeply curious about where it would lead. The first few weeks of the arrangement were remarkable in a purely culinary sense. Reyes was extraordinary to watch. He moved through my small kitchen the way a musician moves through a familiar instrument, adjusting, listening, making decisions with a speed that seemed almost unconscious. He brought his own knives, his own specialty ingredients. He did not explain what he was making until it was plated in front of me. The deposits climbed significantly. Evenings when Reyes cooked produced payouts between $400 and $1,200. On one occasion, after a 4-course meal he described only as a study in restraint, I received a deposit of just over $3,000. I was building a detailed chart of every meal, every deposit, every message from the entity. I had started to understand the entity's preferences clearly enough to predict rough deposit ranges based on ingredients alone. It liked red wine, not white. It was drawn to dishes with strong umami profiles. It responded powerfully to sweetness paired with acid, the way a good dessert balances richness with brightness. Home-cooked food performed better than restaurant food, all else being equal. Meals eaten in silence produced higher deposits than meals eaten during conversation, as though the focused attention mattered. Meanwhile, I was still asking questions, still spelling out answers over patient, incremental nights. I asked the entity its name. The answer came over 2 nights. No, and then name. It did not have one anymore, or it no longer used one, or the concept did not apply. I could not tell which. I asked whether it was lonely. The answer took 4 nights. Used, to be. My closest friend Nina noticed the change in me before I told her anything. "You are distracted," though she said, over coffee one afternoon. Not in a bad way, more like you are running a constant background process. She was not wrong. Even when I was not actively working on the charts or asking questions, some part of my mind was always processing it. The entity's preferences, its messages, the emerging picture of whatever it was and wherever it existed. It had become a second occupation. "What does it want?" she asked eventually. "To experience things," I said. "Food, taste, presence. I think being attached to someone like this is the only sensory access it has to the world." "And you are comfortable being that access?" I paused. "I think so." She looked at me in a way that suggested she was not sure she agreed. About 4 months into the arrangement with Reyes, I began to have doubts that I could not dismiss. The deposits were significant. My financial situation had genuinely improved. I had started saving properly for the first time in years. Priya commented that I seemed more settled, less stressed. Objectively, the arrangement was working. But Nina's question kept returning to me. What does it want? The entity wanted to eat, to taste. It had found in me a particularly clear perceptual channel, and it had attached to that channel, and it was, in some sense I could not fully articulate, living through my meal times. Every night at 7 o'clock I was not just eating dinner, I was feeding something that could not eat. I started asking harder questions. Did it have any influence over events in my life beyond the deposits? I got a careful, slow yes. Had it ever used that influence without my knowledge? A long pause before the yes. I asked what it had influenced. The answer came over 5 nights. Brought Reyes to you first night. The reservation Priya had made 6 weeks in advance for a specific night at a specific time. The dish Reyes had chosen to bring to the table personally, the exact timing. It had arranged our meeting. I did not tell Priya. I did not want her to feel that the celebration, her effort, her pride in me had been engineered. Even if it had been, those things were real, her feelings were real. I kept that to myself. But I sat with it for a while and it changed things. I told Nina. She said what I had already been thinking. If it had done it once, there was no reason to believe it had not done other things. I could not audit my own life for its fingerprints. I did not know which decisions had been mine and which had been gently arranged. That feeling of not knowing is harder to carry than I expected. I kept eating dinner at 7. I kept getting deposits. I kept asking questions. But something had shifted. The arrangement no longer felt like a strange but manageable situation I was navigating with curiosity. It felt like something I was inside of, without a clear view of the edges. I told Reyes what I had learned. He was standing at my stove, reducing a sauce, and he listened without turning around. "Did you already know?" I asked. "I suspected," he said. "My first serious job offer. An investor who appeared at exactly the right time." I stopped asking where things came from. "Does it not bother you?" He finally turned around. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the cooking. "Everything that gave me my career," he said, "came from this. I made real food. I have real skills. The work is mine, even if the opportunity was arranged. That is what I tell myself." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I decided to stop the arrangement, not dramatically. I just told Reyes that I needed a break, and I told the entity, in a quiet room before a meal I had cooked myself, that I needed time to think. For 3 weeks I skipped dinner at 7. I ate late, or early, or not at all. The deposit stopped. The entity sent no messages. The silence was strange, like turning off a piece of equipment that had been running in the background for so long you stopped hearing it, and then you turn it off, and the absence is louder than the noise was. I felt clearer. I also felt poorer, and more alone, and more uncertain about what I had given up. On a Tuesday morning, I received an email from my main client studio informing me that they were going in-house for post-production and would no longer be contracting out. 3 years of consistent work, gone in 2 sentences. That same afternoon, Nina texted me to tell that a mutual colleague had taken a position that I had been informally being considered for. The timing did not feel accidental. I sat in my apartment that evening at my kitchen table, and I cooked dinner for the first time in 3 weeks. Simple food, roasted vegetables, good bread, a glass of the red wine the entity had always responded well to. I sat down at 7 o'clock. I said nothing to the empty room. The deposit that night was $240. No cents, no message, just the money. I am still eating at 7. I will not pretend I made a fully informed, uncoerced choice to resume. The job loss created a pressure the entity may or may not have engineered, and I cannot know for certain. I have made peace, or something resembling peace with not knowing. What I have is this. Every night at 7 o'clock I prepare a meal as carefully as I can. I sit down, I eat slowly and with attention. I notice the flavors and the textures and the way a good meal settles into the body when you give it proper time. I think about what I am feeding and what it means to share a sensory experience with something that cannot have one on its own. Sometimes, if the meal is very good, I get the impression of something like gratitude in the messages that follow. Small, unprompted words. Good, warm, yes. Nina says I have rationalized a situation I cannot escape into something that feels like meaning. She might be right. Reyes says the work is real even if the conditions were arranged. He might be right too. All I know is this. Every evening at 7 o'clock I sit down to eat. And I am not eating alone.